There he is. Good morning everyone, and thanks for coming today. I'm about to tell you the amazing story of Willem Daniel Delprat and how his vision affected all of our lives. But first, let me mention my own connections with this high achiever. I'm Carl Delprat, and GDD is my great-grandfather. Not long after the birth of my younger brother Christopher, our parents separated. We three then lived with my mother's benevolent parents at 124 Bull Street, Mayfield. Each morning I would look down from their hilltop home onto these giant vibrant factories of burning gas, steam, sirens and smoke. My mother Mercia so often told me, "Your great-grandfather caused all of this to happen." This bewildering announcement always went straight over my young head. When my schooling was completed, she suggested I borrow from the local library a copy of A Vision of Steel by Paquita Mawson. Inside I found a praiseworthy introduction by Essington Lewis and a foreword by Prime Minister Robert Menzies, who described GDD as an explorer with a special kind of genius and imagination that worked for the future. My mother's perception proved correct, and this scholarly experience became a watershed moment. Started a BHP apprenticeship, and to my astonishment, no mention of GD Delprat was anywhere to be found. While attending weekend dances, I discovered 1/4 of Newcastle's girl high students either played or barracked for Delprat House. When riding my motorcycle through Beresfield, I uncovered a Delprat Avenue. According to my mother, GDD's portrait was exhibited pre-war at Newcastle Town Hall. However, that had now vanished and nobody there knew where it went. So for someone who's been primarily responsible for industrialising my Newcastle, he's stuck. His memory appeared somewhat bleach, leaving a teenage mind to ponder. Could it all be somehow connected with his horrible pollution? At the age of 21, my love life crashed and I had a Foreign Legion moment. Flipped a coin, heads Brisbane, tails Sydney. 3.5 hours later, a light blue Peugeot 203 parked outside Aunt Moyna's Newcastle, Sydney residence. And shortly afterwards, reconnection commenced with my father, Adrian John Delprat, and eventually many other relatives I'd only ever seen in photographs. I was amazed to discover so many parallels in temperament. 6 months later, the fates truly blessed me when Colleen, that lovely mate and girl I thought lost forever, reconnected, then transferred to Sydney. Within 7 months, we were married in a Beauty Point church. After 2 years of Sydney living, I'd had more than enough and returned to Newcastle, where I studied mechanical engineering for 5 years and then another 4 years of management. While attending night school, I worked at the BHP, tried a few other locations, then finally dropped anchor at the Commonwealth Steel. My 30-year grand tour included the various roles of inspector, heat treatment supervisor, mill foreman, construction engineer, rolling mill superintendent, maintenance superintendent, works maintenance superintendent, foundry manager and project engineer. Maybe some of you can see similar ripples in the same pond. I certainly can. My father won the lottery, then visited Holland, where he met many Delprats, including Daniel Apollinus Delprat, a member of the States General and a former director of the Dutch shipping lines. William Henry Marie Delprat, whose signature once appeared on all the Dutch Gilder banknotes. If you are curious, Australian Delprats are across the internet. Paul Delprat, principal of the Julian Ashton Art School. Carmen Delprat, teacher of art. Carmen Delprat, a recognised photographer. Myself, 16 fiction novels, book reviewer, wood sculpture and harpsichord maker. Before the BHP chose our town as their BHP steelworks site, Maitland was the provincial centre point, while Newcastle, experiencing an economic depression, remained stagnant. Fortunately for our city, GDD became the catalyst of change and transformations. Yes, if those dominoes had fallen in other directions, many of our ancestors may have never met, and consequently this dwelling, some grandparents, our parents and including us could have never existed. Also, those immigrants searching globally for employment would have migrated elsewhere. The first Delprat mentioned on the family tree, along with his 2 wives and 10 children, was a Huguenot living in the south of France named Antonin Delprat. Previous to this entry, the Delprats had originated within the Basque provinces. When Louis XIV forbade their Protestant belief, this family of Huguenot Delprats migrated to the more tolerant Amsterdam and started their successful tobacco firm. A portrait of GDD's grandfather, Daniel Delprat, is the earliest I've uncovered. Daniel served as the court preacher to the Dutch royal family. One of Daniel's 6 sons was Major General Felix Albert Theodore Delprat, Minister for War. His wife Elizabeth Francina delivered 10 children, of which 5 survived. One of them, born in Delft on the 1st of September 1856, was baptised Willem Daniel Delprat. Willem excelled in sculpturing and his schoolmaster wished his prize student to enrol with an art academy. However, Major General Felix Delprat had other ideas. As a lad, GDD's father said one day, "I have given you £1 spending money each year for the last several years. How much of that is in the bank?" GDD replied, "None." "Ah," said the old man, "it'd be time I sent you to Scotland." From 1873 to 1877, GDD and his older brother Theodore Felix Albert served their engineering apprenticeships on the Scottish Tay Bridge construction. This bridge was to be the then longest railway bridge over running water in the world. GDD noticed the diving bell being operated and asked to be transferred to the underwater section. As a powder monkey, GDD carried dynamite inside his shirt to keep it from freezing. The nitroglycerine fumes often gave him terrible headaches. GDD attended evening science and physics classes at Newport-on-Tay and learned differential and integral calculus from his father by post. Along with Dutch and English, he also mastered French, German, Spanish and Italian. Fencing and lawn tennis were his chosen sporting activities. When that Tay Bridge contract was completed, GDD returned to Holland and became the Professor of Physics Assistant at the University of Amsterdam. During the first days of the term, this professor handed a problem to the class that only GDD was able to solve. He was commanded to work it out on the blackboard for the other students. When instructed to read it aloud, GDD remained silent. Later on, the professor asked him, "Why did you refuse?" GDD replied, "To tell you the truth, I do not know the names of those funny Greek characters." Never in his life had this professor heard of an individual who'd gone so far in mathematics, out of a textbook, all by himself. When GDD showed his uncle General Isaac Paul Delprat, the commander of the Royal Military School, examples of the Tay Bridge's technical drawings, his uncle studied them and then finally stated, "That bridge will never stand up, my boy." On the 4th of September 1879, GDD married the girl next door, Henrietta Yass, who lived in the same street. On the 28th of December that year, during a terrible gale, a moving steam train with 70 people on board, plus half a mile of bridge work, collapsed into the freezing River Tay. GDD began his mining career at the Spanish Tharsis sulphur and copper mines, and his fame of opening up Rio Tinto's disused 200-year-old Roman mine soon spread throughout the mining world. Sorry, 2,000-year-old, not. 3 years later, GDD switched to the British Bead Metal Company, and with an annual salary of £700, became general manager of its Spanish concerns. During that time, he visited mines in Mexico, Norway and Canada. By the mid-1880s, GDD was a well-known mining authority. One of his many publications dealing with the mining of unusual wide ore bodies attracted the attention of the BHP's board in Australia. GDD was offered the position of Assistant General Manager at £1,500 a year. That's $178,500 today, including a free house. In 1898, aged 42, GDD arrived in Australia on RMS Himalaya and was met by the General Manager, Sir Alexander Stewart. His wife and 5 of their 7 children landed the following year, then settled in Adelaide. Living in the wild, wild west. Before experiencing the 1890s economic depression, Australia had the highest paid labouring wages in the world. Broken Hill, with its history of violent industrial disturbances, was acknowledged as the most militant place in Australia, where miners' wives armed with axe handles often joined in the picketing. 2 major strikes had already occurred before GDD's arrival, 1892 of 16 weeks over unionism, and another in 1889 over contract labour. GDD's management style initially proved successful, and the board raised his salary to £2,000. Throughout 1902, GDD concentrated on extracting ore from tailings, of which there were 6.5 million unwanted tonnes readily available. In the BHP laboratory, he had observed that by using a solution of acid sodium sulphate, known as salt cake, they could make zinc sulphide in the tailings, attach to bubbles, to gas bubbles, and float, thereby effecting a separation. GDD sold his patent to the BHP for £1,000. Meanwhile, C.V. Potter, a chemist brewer based in Melbourne, was working on a similar process using sulphuric acid, and had also placed a patent. When hearing of this BHP patent, C.V. Potter sued the BHP, resulting in a lengthy litigation process that reached the Victorian Supreme Court and eventually the High Court of Australia. The final judgment was in BHP's favour. A large-scale processing plant was quickly built and the process worked. This technique, later known as the Potter-Delprat flotation process, revolutionised the treatment of sulphide ores and allowed mass extractions from a once considered worthless material. 500,000 tonnes of zinc concentrates were now obtained from 1.75 million tonnes of tailings. GDD's annual salary was boosted from £3,000 to £4,000. He then increased BHP's profitability even further through a switch from silver lead to zinc and sulphur, the sinking of another shaft and the addition of another mill, thereby doubling the output of sulphide ore. In 1904, GDD became a nationalised Australian. Perhaps his major contribution during that year was to push for the company's smelters to be relocated at Port Pirie and for the construction of the Iron Knob railways in preparation for the expansion of its ore reserves. That same year, the South Australian Governor-General visited the Broken Hill mines and reported of the excellent relationship between management. Unfortunately, all this civility was about to come to an abrupt end. During 1906, the year of the big underground fire in which GDD was reported in the newspapers as killed while assisting workers, a 2-year-old labour wages agreement had come to its conclusion. John Darling, the BHP's chairman of directors, stated, lead prices had fallen by 40%. Silver was also failing. Americans and Europeans were breaking their contracts. Therefore, wages must now be lowered by 12.5%. As the Broken Hill mine was making a loss, the company now considered shutting it down until a market upturn eventuated. The other Broken Hill mine owners agreed, and the Great Lockout commenced. Members of 10 unions quickly became involved in massive labour disputes of up to 5,000 men regularly assembled outside the trades hall. BHP had already distributed £11 million in dividends and bonuses to the shareholders, so crying poor about the current prices sounded to these now out-of-work miners very hollow indeed. An invitation was sent to Tom Mann, a then famous union organiser and with noted oratorical powers, to come and organise them. Tom Mann had been a keen organiser in the 1889 London dock strike. He arrived in Australia in 1902 and became an organiser for the fledgling Australian Labor Party. Following some disputes, Mann resigned, then founded the Victorian Socialist Party. Within 3 weeks of Tom Mann's arrival at Broken Hill, an additional 1,600 miners have now joined the miners' union. Early in the strike, GDD often directly communicated with Tom Mann and once spoke to an assembly at the Broken Hill Trades Hall stating the company's case. But Tom Mann's organisational and rhetoric skills soon proved to be exceptionally good, and in due time he became the BHP board's recognised nemesis. From then on, GDD insisted on Mann's exclusion from any conferences. Tom Mann placed a fortified picket around the mine and generally kept the strikers under firm control. Fresh pickets accompanied by a brass band changed shifts in an orderly fashion and maintained the mine's isolation. GDD called for additional police protection. He barricaded himself at the mine with a force of company officers and 90 police equipped with weapons. It was now a matter of just how long their provisions would last. John Darling had many newspaper friends and through them demanded military intervention. Under pressure, Premier C.G. Wade supplied a trainload of police and mounted police. In due time, they found very little to do and had to contend with blacklisting from the local businesses and the residents' hatred. The situation had become a stalemate. Broken Hill was an isolated city of 38,000 inhabitants where living costs were 30% above the coastal cities. The mining companies owned the water supply and part of the train line. To arrive at Broken Hill station from Sydney involved a very long train trip via Melbourne and Adelaide. The strike must have been a living hell for all involved. The deadlock was finally broken when Tom Mann was arrested. The trumped-up charge had accused Mann and others of intending to storm the mine. His trial was held in a far-removed country location of Albury, where a jury of conservative farmers surprisingly acquitted him of any wrongdoings. 3 other union officials were jailed and one of them for 2 years. Following the company's abrasive industrial relations and criticisms from another mining manager, GDD quit the Mine Managers Association presidency. After 5 bitter months, the strike finally ended and a limited number of workers who weren't victimised went back to work. Mann's appointment of organiser ended almost simultaneously. Opinions differ as to how much a victory it was, or if this lockout was warranted, as the price of lead now soared to £18 a tonne. Resentment remained rife, and a further 2 massive strikes followed, one in 1915 lasting 7 months, and another of 8 months ending in 1920. By 1910, BHP GDP's period of huge profit making at Broken Hill was over, and I'm of the opinion GDD had more than a gutful of the industrial unrest in this loss-making mine. He then focused his energies on moving the smelting processes to Port Pirie, building 9 new smelters and upgrading the railway system for transporting iron ore deposits. Failing to meet with his expectations and disheartened by his interpretation of the narrow-mindedness within the Australian labour movement, Tom Mann sailed home to Britain, where he resumed his role as strike organiser and coordinator of union activities. Tom Mann then became a founding member of the British Communist Party. In July 1910, the Delprats went to Melbourne for the wedding of GDD's son Theo and Renee Lamb. They're my grandparents. Around that period, GDD had a home built at Brighton, South Australia, and at the age of 54, he began to learn the masteries of jiu-jitsu. Theo was offered a position with the De Beers mine in South Africa, and GDD advised him to accept. Daughters Mary and Leica had become medical postgraduates. GDD convinced the BHP board to switch from silver to steel, or they would face certain death. GDD's younger daughter Bequita, an author of the book A Vision of Steel, became engaged to the famous Arctic explorer Sir Douglas Mawson. They married 4 years later in Melbourne, March 1914. During 1912, GDD took 6 months leave to check out the advances in steel making and visited 23 plants throughout Europe and America. On his return, he presented a report of his findings to the board, pointing out Australian iron ore carries 68% of iron, while the European ore only 35 to 55%. While visiting the USA, GDD engaged Mr. David Baker, an eminent first-class expert on steel from Philadelphia. David Baker recommended Newcastle as an ideal site for steelworks, and GDD set that possibility into motion. With the help of John Darling, GDD persuaded the BHP board to consider establishing a steelworks in Newcastle utilising the iron knob deposit. As most of the once busy inner city mines had now closed, Newcastle had become a place of great poverty. David Baker oversaw the birth of the Newcastle Steelworks and became its first works manager from 1915 to 1924. Essington Lewis, a young Broken Hill mining engineer, impressed GDD with his organising ability. Lewis was moved to BHP's head office in Melbourne to become GDD's chosen assistant. In his book, Australian Labour Leader, Dr. H.V. Emmett on page 308 says, then Delprat, the brilliant manager of BHP Company Limited, decided upon the establishment of his company of steelworks at Newcastle. In May, he informed the government that the company had determined to erect iron and steelworks in connection with their iron knob SA deposit. He states further, in August 1915, less than 3 months after Delprat got his bill, 3 years, after Delprat got his bill through, the BHP proceeded to execute large orders of steel rails, both for the Commonwealth and the New South Wales governments. And in 1919, the production was less than half of the steel imported cost. GDD's salary had now risen to £5,500. During initial construction of the Newcastle Steelworks, he stayed at the Great Northern Hotel and caught a penny tram to Carrington, then walked across the swamp to Port Waratah. He also liked to surf in the mornings and evenings and did physical drill during his lunch break. A set of Roman exercise rooms is on display in the cottage bedroom. GDD promised that if his works were established, employment would be found for 10,000 men and Australia's requirements for steel rail would be supplied as cheaply as if obtained from any other part of the world. He became a prominent and efficient negotiator within the complex negotiations with the Commonwealth and New South Wales governments. His efforts ultimately led to the signing of a contract on the 24th of September 1912 for the erection of a BHP steelworks in Newcastle. The Governor-General Sir Roland Munro Ferguson, with whom GDD had formed a close relationship, opened the works on the 2nd of June 1915. Extract from a speech by GDD Delprat at the opening. The board's ambition is to provide the Commonwealth with steel as cheap a rate as people in Europe and America are being supplied. To use a vigorous speech, he said, we mean to make ploughshares. But at the same time, should any outside nation have the temerity to threaten the independence of this our own country, then they will find us prepared to turn these ploughshares into swords. Where has this vision gone? During 1915, an outbreak of native violence occurred in South Africa, where Theo Delprat was working as a mining engineer. GDD told his son to return home to Australia and he put him through medical school. 5 young Delprat children, including my father, grew up at Dr. Delprat's residence on 100 Spit Road, Moscow, not all that far from where I was married. Prime Minister Billy Hughes offered GDD the job of permanent head of the CSIR, that's the early version of the CSIRO, and was prepared to give him unlimited powers. GDD declined as he would have to give up his job at the BHP. In 1916, GDD's daughter, Dr. Leica Delprat, married Dr. Milo Sprott in England. In 1918, he was created a CBE, that's the commander of the British Empire, and BHP started rolling plates for shipbuilding. GDD developed an interest in aviation and sat on the Defence Board for the construction of aeroplanes. Daughter Carmen married Petrus Tapama in Melbourne that same year. Before commencing a number of extensive visits to the modern United States industrial sites, GDD first visited his younger son, Gwilym Delprat, now an established surgeon at St. Luke's Hospital in San Francisco. During 1919, GDD discussed his retirement with the board. When asked about his replacement, Lewis was recommended. His young age was questioned. GDD replied, he will grow into it. GDD selected protege Essington Lewis was now appointed Assistant General Manager. In March 1921, after some of his decisions had been criticised by Essington Lewis and then overturned by the BHP board, GDD, aged 64, resigned as General Manager. Essington Lewis was then appointed General Manager and in 1926 selected as Managing Director. The post-war worldwide steelmaking glut of 1922 resulted in a temporary closure of the Newcastle Steelworks. It reopened in 1923 with lower operating costs and was able to weather the oncoming depression. Works manager David Baker retired in 1924 and was replaced by Leslie Bradford. Now it was time for retirement. GDD's version was to become a chairman of Rylands Limited and a life member of the board of the Melbourne Public Hospital. He was also offered the position of Railways Commissioner of New South Wales at £5,000 a year and also the chairman of New South Wales Water and Sewerage Board. Both proposals were declined. With conferences at Rylands, inspections of the dams and coalfields, meetings of the Single Purpose League and the occasional CSIR, plus sculpturing, building, radios, billiards, bridge and chess, GDD lived a very busy retirement. A bust of Braille won him second prize at the Paris Art Exhibition. A speech by Mr. GDD Delprat before the Millionaires Club in 1920 concluded with the words, I do not wish to pose as a prophet, but I think that Newcastle before many years will be the great industrial centre of Australia. Nothing can stop it. I can see the river dredged for many miles and lined with factories throbbing with electrical power. Excuse me. I've often been called an optimist. The charge is probably true, but I even imagine that someday the bar will be dredged to admit the largest ocean-going steamers. If I was not an optimist with all these advantages, I should indeed be suffering with a yellow streak and not be worthy of the confidence placed in me by the board of directors and by the community at large. Yes, he certainly had the vision, but look where we are today, just the third world nation of primary exports. GDD made his last visit to Newcastle for the BHP's 1935 Golden Jubilee and stayed at this cottage. It was specially prepared for his stay, and in that year he became the first recipient of the Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy Medal. On March 15, 1937, following a short illness, he died in Melbourne, aged 81. From what I can gather, cause of death was a malignant melanoma that had started on his back. To his wife Henrietta, his two sons Theo and young Willie, 5 daughters Elizabeth, Carmen, Mary, Leonti and Paquita, I'm using their nicknames, he left an estate of £59,600. That's about 2.2 million today, but cost of living was totally different back then. GD Delprat was quite modest and kindly. He handled his staff well, carried the respect of others, and often far-seeing when broad issues were concerned. The beneficial effect of his work was not fully realised until the Second World War broke out, for the steel and munitions produced by the BHP was then of incalculable value to Australia. As for the present, we have the Australian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy's Delprat Distinguished Annual Lecture Series. Newcastle has Delprat Avenue and Delprat Cottage. Canberra has a Delprat Circuit. Whale, a Delprat Terrace Apartments and Delprat Terrace. Broken Hill, of all places, have named Shaft Block 12 the Delprat Mine and then made it into a tourist attraction. So how's that for irony? What about the future? I recommend his name be selected as the beacon for the Newcastle University's flagship building, expected to open in 2023. Any questions?
Well done.
Very
Well,
good.
thanks for all Bob Cook's great workers who made this place as it is for you. They put in an enormous effort.
Yeah. Thank you, Bob. It was terrific.